I am here to talk about a possible link between radiation and mind control experimentation.
Dr. Green was using me mostly as a mind control subject. His objective was to gain control of my mind and train me to be a spy assassin.
I urge you to recommend an investigation into these matters.
From the attempts at controlling the mind through the use of LSD that you're all so familiar with, to the sexual abuse of adults and children in an attempt to turn them into spies and assassins who block out the memories of their operations due to trauma. This is the full story of Project MK Ultra. Sit back and let's relax as we explore just what Project MK Ultra really entailed.
It just doesn't make sense.
But I can't hide. Whoa. I won't hide. Whoa. Yeah. My evil ways.
Welcome back to Maverick Files. I'm your host, Tetsuya. And tonight I'm going to be sharing with you all just how deep the MK Ultra rabbit hole really goes, and uncovering the facts and accusations surrounding one of the most infamous CIA experiments of all time.
Thank you for making the effort to come up to speak to us today.
Okay, I'm going to start. My name is Valerie Wolf. In listening to the testimony today, it all sounds really familiar. I am here to talk about a possible link between radiation and mind control experimentation that began in the late 90s.
The main aim of Project MK Ultra was to be able to create a special drug, substance, or procedure that would allow the United States government to weaken the minds of those that they desired and grant them the power to force confessions during interrogations using a mind control of sorts. This project was officially sanctioned in 1953 and wasn't officially halted by the US until the year 1973. 20 years of research and development focusing solely on controlling the minds of interrogation subjects and forcing them to give the confessions that the CIA desired. The project used various methods in order to achieve their goals, including the administration of dangerously high doses of different psychoactive drugs and other drugs such as LSD, mescaline, heroin, barbiturates, morphine, psilocybin, and more. They also used electroshocks to try and control the mind, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, torture, and sexual abuse.
I have specialized in treating victims and perpetrators of trauma and their families. When word got out that I was appearing at this hearing, nearly 40 therapists across the country, and I had about a week and a half to prepare.
According to Stephen Kinzer, Project MK Ultra was a continuation of the work that began in World War II era Japanese facilities and Nazi concentration camps. He also wrote that the use of mescaline on subjects was a practice that Nazi doctors had begun in Dachau concentration camps. Kinzer also said that this was the continuation of a Nazi agenda, citing the CIA's secret recruitment of Nazi torturers and vivisectionists to continue the experimentation on thousands of subjects, and Nazis that they brought to Fort Detrick, Maryland, to instruct CIA officers on the lethal uses of sarin gas. Furthermore, at the end of the Second World War, the US gave the researchers of the Japanese Research and Experimentation Unit 731 a pardon in exchange for all of their research gathered from experimenting on humans. Some of these experiments included forced pregnancy, exposing the pregnant women to diseases and being shot in non-fatal areas, and finally opening them up and studying the effects of all these things on the unborn fetus. This unit faced no repercussions for the war crimes, and the US pardoned them in secret, Kinzer also states that Project MKUltra was partly inspired by these tests, as well as the Nazi experimentation. The project was initially very broad, and researched the effects of drugs and other experiments at 80 different institutions, which included hospitals, universities, and prisons, all carried out under the noses of the general public. Many volunteers for the project were unaware of the kind of experiments that they were volunteering for due to the secrecy of the project, and did not know the nature of the experiment even as the psychoactive drugs began to kick in. This project was directed by one Sidney Gottlieb, who was an American chemist and spy master, but he began the project on the order of CIA agent Alan Dulles in 1953.
Other names that have come to light are Dr. Sidney Gottlieb and Dr. Martin Orne, who it is reported were also involved in radiation research. It needs to be made clear that people have remembered these names and
Gottlieb initially joined as a poison expert and quickly received the nicknames Black Sorcerer and Dirty Trickster, thanks to his hand in lethal poison and drug experiments that the subjects had usually not given their consent for, and were unaware of the lethality of the experiments. The project began because the United States were worried that the Soviets were already performing these kinds of tests and experiments, so the US wanted to fight back and beat them to developing an effective mind control. The US wanted to use the same techniques that were reportedly used by the Koreans and Chinese on US prisoners of war during the Korean War. The project was interested in manipulating foreign leaders such as Fidel Castro, and made many schemes to attempt to drug him. The experiments were often conducted without the subject's consent or knowledge, and they used both American and Canadian citizens who were completely unsuspecting. In some cases, academic researchers were funded through grants from CIA-front organizations, but were unaware that the CIA was using their work for these purposes. Some historians, and also some survivor accounts and testimonies, suggest that one of the alternative goals of the project was not just to coerce confessions out of prisoners, but also to develop a form of mind control that would allow them to manipulate people into becoming spies or performing secret tasks and operations that they would forget due to the trauma that they had endured and also the brainwashing. It's possible, and is also claimed by historian Alfred W. McCoy, that the CIA have deliberately shifted the media's attention on some of the more ridiculous programs in order to divert the public's attention away from some of the more sinister crimes that they committed. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered that all files pertaining to MKUltra were to be destroyed, which hampered any investigative efforts into the project, and the CIA's involvement. Only a very small number of documents survived the order of destruction, but in 1977, a request under the Freedom of Information Act uncovered a cache of 20,000 documents that contained information about Project MKUltra, and makes up a large part of the information that we have available to use about Project MKUltra today.
and pain induction techniques such as electric shock, use of hallucinogens, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, dislocation of limbs, and sexual abuse is remarkable. There is almost nothing published on it.
At the request of the CIA, the mind control experiments of Project MKUltra were exported to Canada, where they set up a new institution and recruited British psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron to head these experiments. These were dubbed the Montreal experiments, and they started out as an attempt to treat schizophrenia and cure people of it, but it eventually devolved into something much, much worse. These experiments were conducted at the Allen Memorial Institute of McGill University. The subjects that came in were not volunteers for mind control experiments, but were instead unsuspecting Canadian citizens who were suffering from common conditions such as anxiety disorders and postpartum depression, and they came seeking help for these conditions. Cameron created a brand new theory of his own, which he called psychic driving, which caught the attention of the CIA. Initially, Cameron had been hoping to cure people of their schizophrenia by eradicating all of their existing memories, and eventually reprogramming their psyche entirely. Cameron used LSD and various paralytic drugs, as well as electroshock therapy at 30 to 40 times more powerful than the normal power used in previous MKUltra electroshock experiments. For his driving experiments, Cameron would use drugs and electroshocks to induce comas in his patients, which lasted for weeks on end, and in one case lasted 3 entire months, all while playing simple, repetitive words, noises, or sentences on a loop while they were comatose, in order to wipe their memories and make them a blank slate when they awoke. Cameron had the repetition of these words last up to 16 hours a day, and the messages, which were either personal, negative, or positive, could be repeated 500,000 times in a single day. One of the worst of all the experiments were the sensory deprivation experiments that Cameron performed. He was inspired by the work of Donald Hebb, and included his techniques in his treatment. Cameron would deprive patients of their senses by covering their ears, eyes, or skin, while constantly injecting them with LSD and other drugs to keep them in a constant state of paralysis. They were also given very little food and water over the course of this procedure, and instead focused on injecting them with different substances. Of course, these experiments failed to have their intended effect, and instead caused many horrible side effects in the patients, including urinary incontinence, amnesia, forgetting how to talk, forgetting their parents, and believing that their interrogators were their parents. It is estimated that Cameron experimented on a total of 300 different Canadian citizens, but it is unknown exactly just how many he experimented on. None of them had given informed consent to the procedures that they underwent, and the patients experimented on were both adults and children alike. Many of the patients suffered from retrograde amnesia for the remainder of their life, and had to relearn a majority of the basic skills that they possessed before being experimented on. Some of the patients were in a childlike state and even had to be potty trained by their family, who described them as even more emotionally unstable than before, and many were unable to live a normal life afterwards. To this day, the topic of the experiments of Montreal have been kept in the dark by the CIA, who actively prevent information about these experiments from being leaked to the public, whether that be through destruction of files or signing non-disclosure agreements. In 2017, the Canadian government reached an out-of-court settlement with the daughter of one of the patients, paying $100,000 in exchange for dropping the legal case and signing a non-disclosure agreement, which would prevent her from talking about the settlement.
What was startling was that therapists reported many of these clients were also physically ill with autoimmune problems, thyroid problems, multiple sclerosis, and other muscle and connective tissue diseases, as well.
In the early 1950s, in areas under the control of the US, in Europe and East Asia, which mostly consisted of Japan, Germany, and the Philippines, the CIA constructed secret detention centers so that the United States could avoid criminal prosecution for the experiments that they wanted to perform. The CIA went out and captured people who they believed to be enemy agents and expendable, and placed them in these detention centers in order to use them for torture and human experimentation. They interrogated the prisoners constantly, all while force-feeding them different psychoactive drugs, subjecting them to electroshock therapy, making them undergo extreme changes in temperature, and subjecting them to sensory isolation in an attempt to better understand how to control and destroy the human mind in the most effective way possible. This all started during the Korean War, when the US received reports of American prisoners of war being experimented on in Korean prisons, and who the United States feared were being turned into Manchurian candidates. The idea was that these American prisoners were being experimented on and being tortured in order to turn them into sleeper agents that they could use against the United States. These reports inspired the US to devise their own scheme to create sleeper agents, which they called Monarch programming. Monarch programming is a form of mind control reportedly used by many covert organizations, which the US tested on both civilians and the military. The entire aim of this programming was to traumatize the subject through the use of electroshocks, torture, mental and physical abuse, and mind games in order to get the victim to disassociate from reality, which is a natural response when someone is subjected to unbearable pain. The subject's ability to disassociate is a major requirement, and it is, apparently, most readily found in children that come from families with multiple generations of abuse. Mental disassociation would enable the handlers to create walled-off personas in the subject's psyche, which can then be programmed and triggered at will. The idea was for the subjects to experience so much trauma that they would disassociate with whatever they were tasked with, and forget after completing the task, leaving no trace or evidence behind. This would create a compartmentalized set of identities in the same person that could perform tasks and then be unaware of what they had done. People who were broken in this way were intended to be turned into couriers for illegal drugs and into assassins and spies. Experimental subjects were subjected in various sub-projects to experiments involving sensory deprivation, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, and other forms of psychological manipulation. The CIA was particularly focused on eliciting an experience of self-blame in the victims of experiments, bringing them to believe that they themselves were responsible for the methods employed upon them rather than the torturers. The primary goal was to determine and undermine every aspect of the target's sense of self: cultural, sexual, physical, emotional, and sociological. On February 19th, 1954, Morse Allen simulated the ultimate experiment in hypnosis, the creation of a Manchurian candidate or programmed assassin. Allen's victim was a secretary, whom he put into a deep trance and told her to keep sleeping until he ordered otherwise. He then hypnotized a second secretary, and told her that if she could not wake up her friend, her rage would be so great that she would not hesitate to kill. Allen left a pistol nearby, which the secretary had no way of knowing was unloaded, even though she had earlier expressed a fear of firearms of any kind. She picked up the gun and shot her sleeping friend. After Allen brought the killer out of her trance, she had apparent amnesia for the event, denying that she would ever shoot anyone. With this experiment, Morse Allen took the testing as far as he could on a make-believe basis, but he was neither satisfied nor convinced that hypnosis would produce such spectacular results in an operational setting. All he felt he had proved was that an impressionable young volunteer would accept a command from a legitimate authority figure, to take an action she may have sensed would not end in tragedy. She presumably trusted the CIA enough as an institution, and Morse Allen as an individual, to believe that he would not let her do anything wrong. Morse Allen kept requesting prolonged access to operational subjects, such as the double agents and defectors on whom he was allowed to work a day or two. The hope was to take an existing ego state, such as an imaginary childhood playmate, and build it into a separate personality, unknown to the first. The hypnotist wanted to communicate directly with this schizophrenic offshoot and command it to carry out specific deeds, about which the main personality would know nothing. It is unknown whether the United States were able to completely hypnotize a person and turn them into a Manchurian candidate, due to the destruction of so many files.
Furthermore, if, as the evidence suggests, some of these people were used in radiation experiments, there might be information in the mind control experiment files on radiation experiments.
In 1995 and 1996, 3 witness testimonies about the horrors of MKUltra were shared in a court, in front of a judge and jury, after talking to a therapist by the name of
Valerie Wolf.
These people claimed to have been unaware of the sexual abuse and other torture that they suffered from a young age at the hands of MKUltra, due to the trauma that they endured, which caused them to forget the things that they experienced and repressed it. One of the victims claimed to have been part of the project from as young as age 7, and stated that the brainwashing they endured included torture, sexual abuse, electroshock therapy, powerful drugs, hypnosis, and death threats. According to the rest of the testimony, they claimed that the CIA then induced amnesia in them in order to prevent them from recalling these terrifying sessions, and to cover up any evidence that could be used against them. Both Wolf and her patients stated that they recovered the memories of the CIA program without regression or hypnosis techniques. In other words, these patients spontaneously discovered this information about themselves and their past, Although the committee was mainly concerned with radiation, they permitted Valerie and her patients to testify because, astonishingly, several doctors who had administered the mind control experiments had also been identified by other Americans secretly exposed to radiation. Prominent names surfaced in the March 15th testimony. Richard Helms, former head of the CIA, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, who ran MK Ultra, and Dr. John Gittinger, Gottlieb's protege. These men and others were directly accused of participating in grisly mind control effects on children. These testimonies were dismissed in court and received no media attention, but video evidence of the testimonies and transcripts of these testimonies are available online. Chris DiNicola was another of Dr. Wolf's patients who testified, and even named her controller as Dr. L. Wilson Green, who was also reported by other supposed mind control subjects. She claimed that Dr. Green used me in radiation experiments, both for the purpose of determining the effects of radiation on various parts of my body, and to terrorize me as an additional trauma in the mind control experiments. She was only 8 years old at the time. She further went on to say,
The rest of the experiments took place in Tucson, Arizona, out in the desert. I was taught how to pick locks, be secretive, use my photographic memory, and a technique to withhold information by repeating numbers to myself. Dr. Green moved on to wanting me to kill dolls that look like real children. I stabbed a doll with a spear once after being severely traumatized, but the next time I refused. He used many pain induction techniques, but as I got older, I resisted more and more. He often tied me down in a cage, which was near his office. Between 1972 and 1976, he and his assistants were sometimes careless and left the cage unlocked. Whenever physically possible, I snuck into his office and found files with reports and memos addressed to CIA and military personnel. Included in these files were project, subproject, subject, and experiment names with some code numbers for radiation and mind control experiments, which I have submitted in your written documentation. I was caught twice, and Dr. Green ruthlessly used electric shock, drugs, spun me on a table, put shots in my stomach, in my back, dislocated my joints, and hypnotic techniques to make me feel crazy and suicidal. I know I can get better. I am getting better. And I know others can too, with the proper help. Please help us in an effort to prevent these heinous acts from continuing in the future. Thank you very much.
An organization was founded in 1992 and was only dissolved in 2019, called the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, which was founded after the founder's adult daughter, Jennifer Freed, accused her father, Peter Freed, of sexual abuse when she was a child. The foundation sought to discredit Jennifer's accusations and many other people's accusations, and said that their now adult children were victims of therapists who encouraged the recovery of false memories. A particular focus of the foundation was the diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder. Interestingly, several of the board members of this foundation, such as Dr. Louis Jolyon West, have strong ties to the CIA and military intelligence, and West himself was part of Project MK Ultra and performed his own experiments inspired by his experience. This brings us to the end of all we know about Project MK Ultra for sure. As recently as 2018, files are still being discovered regarding the project, one of which talked about embedding an electrode within the skull of 6 different dogs, and attempting to control them with signals to the brain through a remote control. They underwent surgery to have a device implanted in their brains to control their motor functions, using electric shockwave signaling. It's entirely possible that many more children and adults were experimented on who are too scared to come forward or simply cannot remember what they experienced due to the trauma that they suffered. Project MKUltra remains simultaneously one of the most well-known projects, yet least known about due to the destruction of so many crucial documents and large misinformation on the internet. Maybe in time we will come to know more, but for now, this was the truth about Project MKUltra that they don't tell you.